Good evening to everyone who's joined us. We'll just wait a few more minutes until we get everyone in the room. We were happy to have about 200 individuals register for this event. So once we get to about that number, we'll start a discussion tonight. Thanks again for joining us. Okay, so we'll get started. Good evening, everyone. My name is Dennis Wieboldt, and I'm an executive board member of the Bellarmine Law Society and a rising sophomore at Boston College studying history and theology. I would like to begin tonight by welcoming you to this co-hosted event from the Bellarmine Law Society and the Boston College AHANA Pre-Law Student Association entitled Civil Rights and Injustice, Where We've Been, Where We Are, and Where We're Going. Thank you to our three panelists, Dr. Summers, Dr. Glass, and Dr. Barrozo for joining us, my fellow student organizers, Anthony, Devianna, and Amanda, for making this event possible, and the Boston College Office of Information Technology Services, especially Scott Can, Mike Gallagher, and Tom Malik, for assisting with tonight's virtual interface. Before I turn things over to my colleagues, I would just like to give a brief overview of how our conversation tonight will flow. After hearing a brief message from the other student organizers of tonight's event, we'll briefly introduce our panelists, begin our discussion, and then conclude with the questions posed by you, our audience. Throughout tonight's conversation, if you'd like to ask a question of a member of our panel, please visit https://tinyurl.com/civilrightsquestions. This URL has also been provided to you in the registration email that was sent earlier. And with that, I'll turn it over to Anthony.
Thank you, Dennis, and hello, everyone. My name is Anthony Kim, and I'm the president of the Boston College AHANA Pre-Law Student Association and a rising senior studying political science and film studies. The AHANA Pre-Law Student Association is a pre-professional organization at Boston College which promotes the goals of pre-law students, instills greater awareness, commitment to the needs of the AHANA community, and encourages students to pursue careers in the legal field. Along with Dennis, I will be co-moderating tonight's Q&A event. Devianna?
Thank you, Anthony, and hello, everyone. My name is Devianna Smith, and I'm a rising sophomore studying political science and communication with minor in management and leadership. I am also the current vice president of the AHANA Pre-Law Student Association, and I'm excited to be co-moderating tonight's event panel discussion with Amanda, who I'll turn it over to.
Thank you, Devianna, and good evening, everyone. My name is Amanda Bradley, and I am a rising senior studying political science, international studies, and management and leadership in the Carroll School of Management. I'm the president of the Bellarmine Law Society, a pre-professional student organization founded over 30 years ago with the intention of providing resources and information to prepare students for law school. The society is named after St. Roberto Bellarmino. I look forward to tonight's conversation and would like to again thank everyone who has helped plan this event, our panelists, and our attendees. I will now turn it back over to Anthony.
Thanks, Amanda. It is my pleasure to begin tonight's panelist introductions with Dr. Martin Summers. Dr. Summers is a professor of history and African diaspora studies at Boston College and received his Ph.D. in U.S. history from Rutgers University. He's a cultural historian of the 19th and 20th century United States, particular research and teaching interests in race, gender, sexuality, and medicine. He regularly teaches courses on post-1865 U.S. and African American history, gender and sexuality in African American history, and medicine and public health in the African diaspora. Dr. Summers' current book project, Inner City Blues, African American Mental Health and Social Policy in 20th Century Urban America, is a historical examination of how social scientists, psychiatrists, and psychiatric social workers, government officials, and community organizers understood the relationship between urbanization and mental illness, and consequently sought to address the mental health care needs of African Americans in so-called ghettos. Dr. Summers' research has been supported by the Ford Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, and the National Humanities Center. Dr. Summers, welcome.
Thank you.
Our second panelist in tonight's conversation is Dr. Michael Glass. Dr. Glass is an assistant professor of history at Boston College and received his Ph.D. from Princeton University. He is a political and urban historian of the 20th century United States with research and teaching interests in racism, capitalism, and inequality. His first book, tentatively titled Schooling Suburbia, The Politics of School Finance in Post-War Long Island, is a comparative history of the educational inequality in the archetypical suburbs of Long Island. Focusing on the interaction of real estate, municipal debt, and fiscal politics, Schooling Suburbia reveals how the post-World War II suburban boom rested on a fragile foundation of debt and how it established resource disparities that shaped American politics over the ensuing decades. Dr. Glass's research has been supported by the National Academy of Education, Spencer Dissertation Fellowship, and the Woodrow Wilson Scholars Fellowship. Prior to graduate school, he worked as a high school teacher for 7 years in New York City public schools, where he taught United States and global history. Dr. Glass, welcome.
Thank you.
Now, our third panelist tonight is Dr. Paulo Barrozo. Dr. Barrozo is an associate professor at Boston College Law School and received his S.J.D. from Harvard Law School and his Ph.D. in political science from the Rio de Janeiro University Research Institute. His work offers new understandings of rights, punishment, cruelty, structural mercy, the nature of the political realm, legal education, markets institutionalization, and evolution of law. In his pro bono activities, Barrozo advocates for the rights of children and the neurodiverse. Dr. Barrozo, welcome.
Thank you, Anthony.
Thanks again to all of our panelists for joining us tonight. Before I turn things over to Amanda and Devianna for the main portion of our discussion tonight, I would just like to briefly articulate something that's been weighing on my mind in the past few weeks. And that's the unfortunate frequency with which we still need to have conversations about injustice in the 21st century US. Although I'm confident that tonight our panelists will be helpful in describing the faults of social systems, which have not provided the relief they were perhaps intended to create, I've also found myself wondering why this word justice, or better, injustice, seems to never disappear. To an extent, I think that the ubiquity of injustice in our world and the feeling of overwhelmingness that it can create leads to the very apathy that allows unjust systems to perpetuate. After all, where should you start to fix broken systems that are 2, 3, 4 centuries years old? As we begin tonight's panel, I hope it's helpful to keep in mind that the very themes that animate the Black Lives Matter movement, freedom, liberation, and justice, are the same themes that mark even Exodus, the second book of the Old Testament to which millennia of humanity have laid claim to. At least in my estimation, it's taking account of the fact that these ideals, as fleeting as they may be, have been the subject of human struggle for thousands of years that provides an important level of perspective. That although we might be just the latest chapter in human history, we have the unique opportunity, the agency, to write it in a better way. I truly believe that no matter what your individual religious commitments are, we can all agree that humanity, like justice, is a work in progress. By that same token, whether this is your first or 10th step trying to understand the problems of humanity and justice that face our society, I hope that our interdisciplinary conversation tonight, one that's grounded in Boston College's rich history of intellectual, personal, and ethical exploration, opens new doors and new inquiries that can help each of us make our chapter a better one. With that, thank you again to our panelists for joining us, and now over to Amanda and Devianna.
Thanks for your thoughts, Dennis. As evident in the title of this event, we would like to start our panel discussion with an inquiry into where we have been. As we turn things over to each of our panelists, we'll spend the first piece of our time tonight delineating the historical development of civil rights and civil rights laws in the United States, with particular attention to each of our panelists' research and teaching experiences. Dr. Summers, if you would like to begin.
Sure, thank you, Amanda. And I want to thank Dennis, Amanda, Anthony, and Devianna for organizing this very important discussion, and also to my fellow panelists and to the attendants. I think it's really important, as Dennis said in his remarks, that to kind of, this question of injustice, and certainly go back to the dawn of humanity. I'm going to give a kind of a broad overview of this question of injustice as it pertains to people of African descent in the United States. But of course, we could go back further when we're thinking about injustices that have been carried out in what is now the United States, much further back than 400 years, if we're thinking about the indigenous peoples um, of the Americas and the injustices that they suffered and continue to suffer. But because of my own research and teaching expertise, I'm going to limit my comments to anti-Black racism today. And as Dennis also said, these are questions that we've been confronted with for 200, 300, 400 years. For 400 years, people of African descent have been trying to get free, right? And free in the most expansive sense of that term. And at various historical moments, we've made significant progress toward that goal, most notably Civil War and emancipation, and the Black freedom struggle in the 20th century. But that progress has always engendered a conservative and a white supremacist backlash. And I'm going to talk a little bit about both the Civil War and emancipation and kind of the progress that emerged out of that particular historical moment, as well as the 20th century Black freedom struggle, before talking a little bit about the backlash that both of those incurred. So if we think about the Civil War, which resulted in emancipation, and we also need to think about emancipation as something that was not given to Black people, right? I mean, Black people actually fought and acquired their freedom. And what emerged out of that, of course, was a significant transformation, right, in the lives of Black people. You had the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. The 13th Amendment actually officially abolished slavery in 1865. The 14th Amendment, which was ratified in 1868, conferred citizenship on African Americans and entitled us to equal protection under the law. And of course, the 15th Amendment in 1870 prohibited it made, I should say, unconstitutional the prohibition of the vote based on race. But once former Confederates regained control of southern states, governments began dismantling the rights of African Americans and systematically discriminating against them, right? And you see this in a number of areas: the exclusion from or segregation within schools, public accommodations, transportation, so forth. You see economic exploitation in the form of sharecropping, debt peonage, and for those African Americans who were increasingly being kind of caught up in the prison system, the convict lease system, and of course disfranchisement, or the stripping of the right to vote from African Americans. And this collection of racist practices and policies, which is known as Jim Crow, really characterized Black life in the country for the next 3 generations, which of course then precipitated the 20th century Black freedom struggle, which, as a result of decades of legal activism and direct action protests, again, also achieved some significant civil rights victories. With Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, you have the nominal ending of school segregation. With the Civil Rights Act of 1964, you have the prohibition of discrimination on the basis of race and sex in areas of employment, education, access to public accommodations, and social services. And with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, you have the strengthening of protection of African American citizens' voting rights. But again, just as in the case of the late 19th century, the post-emancipation period, you see a white supremacist backlash in the beginning in the late 1960s. Actually, we can even kind of date it earlier than that, but certainly full-blown by the late 1960s and early 1970s. one of which, one of the ways that manifested itself was a political realignment in which you have the movement of white Southerners from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. And I think something that's very relevant for us today, the beginnings of the massive expansion of law enforcement apparatus, which really laid the groundwork for mass incarceration and the endemic police brutality and harassment that exists in Black and Brown communities. Now, typically, we typically associate this expansion of the law enforcement apparatus with the conservative law and order politics of the Republican Party in the 1970s and 80s. So think about kind of the response, well, the war on crime and the war on drugs, right? And historians generally think about or look at this backlash as a response to the excesses of the anti-war movement or the urban uprisings in the late 1960s. But importantly, what historians have began to argue is that the seeds for this expansion actually were sown during early in the 1960s during the liberal administrations of the President John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson. And it was during both of those administrations when you begin to see the provision of federal assistance to state and local law enforcement. And with this, local law enforcement begins to increase the size of their police forces, as well as begin to acquire military grade weaponry. And so even as the federal government was putting in place civil rights protections and investing money into anti-poverty programs, it decided to deal with the generational effects of economic exploitation and systemic neglect of Black and Brown communities by turning toward crime control and incarceration. And in a sense, the federal government really opted for a security state rather than economic security, which I think is really a fundamental aspect or reason why we find ourselves where we are today with the various protests that are going on in the country. So I'll end there, and I'm sure I'll kind of weigh back in other points.
Great, thank you so much. Professor Glass or Professor Barrozo, do you have anything that you would like to add?
I think Professor Summers captured sort of the, in a very textured, really rich way, the complexities of this historical process, and I look forward to talking more about that.
I think that my opening comments will sort of build off what Professor Summers has said, so I'll hold off.
One thing I didn't mention too, again, is we not only associate the kind of mass incarceration and expansion of this law enforcement apparatus with the kind of conservative reactionary politics of, say, the Nixon administration, but we also have to kind of think about, again, the more liberal Republicans also participating in this, in addition to liberal Democrats, right? So if we think about something that's, again, largely responsible for the rise of mass incarceration or the Rockefeller drug laws, which were passed in New York by liberal Governor Nelson Rockefeller, which, ended up mandating mandatory sentences for the possession and sale of "quote unquote" hard drugs, which included kind of marijuana and well, not only included kind of opium and heroin and cocaine, but also well, it included those, but it excluded drugs such as hashish and LSD, right, which were more commonly used by white suburbanites. And so you have the implementation of drug laws that are really kind of designed to sweep up and Black and brown people into the carceral state. And it was these Rockefeller drug laws that ended up serving as the basis for other anti-drug laws and anti-crime laws throughout the country, including the 1994 crime bill that, of course, is a topic of conversation now that Joe Biden is running for, or has secured the Democratic nomination.
Thank you so much, Dr. Summers, for your insightful perspective, and thank you for also moving us into the second portion of our panel discussion. So we'd now like to explore where we are. So after the countless murders of Black American lives, such as George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, we've seen a contemporary rise in activism that some have likened to the 1960s civil rights movement. So as we turn things back over to our panelists, we'll be moving into our inquiry into how understandings of civil rights in our current stature might affect civic engagement and legal discourse. Dr. Barrozo, if you'd like to begin.
Thank you, Devianna. So I think I would like to start with a sort of personal perspective. I became American coming from afar. So my first gaze onto the United States was telescopic rather than microscopic. And what that sort of telescopic perspective showed me was that there was a narrative that was very powerful and wrong. So the powerful narrative is this. Out of the Reconstruction legislative project came the 14th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States that created the dual citizenship. So now every resident is a citizen of the state of residence as well as a citizen of the United States. That amendment prevented the states from abridging the privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States, created the right to equal protection of the laws and the right to due process when it comes to life, liberty, and property. Now, the 14th Amendment had a mandate that it gave to Congress. It allowed Congress to pass legislation that would pierce through the jurisdiction of the states of the Federation in order to materialize those rights. So there was an immense moral power in the 14th Amendment that remained stunted, truncated, unrealized for generations. Then came the failures of Reconstruction, came Jim Crow, and then the Civil Rights Movement awoke the moral energy of the 14th Amendment and led the federal executive, legislative, and judicial powers to enact decisions, judicial decisions, legislative decisions, executive orders to address the issues of discrimination, anti-Black discrimination in the United States, anti-women discrimination in the United States, and with time, anti-LGBTQ plus discrimination, anti-disabilities discrimination, and so on and so forth. And then the work that remained to be done was to use this apparatus, legislative apparatus, to come to the court with claims that would help us dismantle all the ways in which discrimination took root in American society and culture, institution after institution. And if we just could stay the course, a day would come when discrimination would be dismantled, at least this systemic structural version of discrimination, and would be in another type of republic. This narrative is wrong because it seems to assume, and I'm delighted that Professor Summers already pointed that out, seem to assume that discrimination is static, while the movement to dismantle it is dynamic. So there are the ubiquitous presence of discrimination in American society, and the civil rights movement and civil rights legislation, civil rights lawsuits, and policies would come after those sites of discrimination, structural and systemic, one by one, setting them down. But looking from afar, so the telescopic view, what it revealed to me, that there was a profound dynamic between the repackaging and reinvention of prejudice in America, discrimination in America, and the civil rights approach to it. Because civil rights, claims of rights violation, are by definition reactive. There is a detected site of violation of a right, a claim to prospective or redressive remedial correction is made, and then if successful, that site of discrimination, that form of discrimination is addressed or ameliorated or dismantled. But what seems to be the case in America is that there is this codependence between the civil rights approach that is reactive and the repackaging and reinvention of discrimination, which is very creative in American culture and American society. So every time there is a realization that there is a site of discrimination or a group that is being discriminated against, and we react in the form of civil rights, discrimination will, if tackled by that claim, if successful, will reemerge, repackaged, relocated in another site, in another form. Then what to do? So I think what needs to be done is to use the moral power, the juridical power of the civil rights movement, of the civil rights approach to this, of the promise of the 14th Amendment, and become fully proactive. And turn our attention not only to reactive lawsuit style appeals to the civil rights legislation in terms of rights claims, the net result of which has been positive is just insufficient, and that at this pace, our grandchildren are going to be debating the same issues. Right? So what we need to do is to combine the reactive civil rights approach to this with a moral energy, with a juridical creativity, not yet seen in American culture and in American society. We need to be proactive. We need to dismantle the cultural roots of discrimination so that it cannot reinvent itself, reemerge here and there when opportunities arrive. And that's the job that will marshal the best of our intellectual and moral imagination. So that's what I think we are, Devianna, in a brief statement.
Thank you so much, Dr. Barrozo, for your very insightful and informative response. Dr. Glass or Dr. Martin, if you have any thoughts on this, that'd be great.
Maybe I'll jump in to talk about this. So Professor Summers kind of gave us the broad overview of the Black freedom struggle and how these are inheritances of longer struggles that go back centuries. And Professor Barrozo has talked about the discriminatory systems and the litigation efforts around civil rights legislation. I would just like to add with where we're at right now that I think it demands almost a history of the past 10 years of the various resistance movements. So I think that the mass protests we see today are really the culmination of political organizing that's happened over the past 10 years. So we can arguably locate the origins of Black Lives Matter movement with the anger over the murder of Trayvon Martin back in 2012. And then the uprisings in Ferguson in 2014 and Baltimore in 2015, along with the protests over various police killings elsewhere in the country. And so a number of grassroots organizations have done a lot of work to stitch together a broader social movement out of these various uprisings. So I'm thinking here of the Movement for Black Lives, the Black Youth Project, the Dream Defenders, Law for Black Lives, Critical Resistance, and the list could go on and on, along with other organizations operating locally. And in addition to those organizations, we could even point to abolitionist scholars like Angela Davis and Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who've been articulating a critique of mass incarceration, not simply to tweak it and change it, but to abolish it altogether since about the 1990s. And so in addition to that, I think that with this near constant political organizing and political resistance, today's uprisings take place after a decade of failed police reforms. So you could, I think a case in point here is Minneapolis, which over the past decade has implemented nearly all of the proposed reforms of policing, like racial bias training or body cameras or diversifying its police force. But none of these measures prevented the killings that sparked the killing that sparked this current uprising. So I think for this reason, we've seen a growing sort of acceptance of abolitionist demands that I think we've all heard of defunding the police. That is to shift funds away from bloated police departments, bloated police budgets, in the way that Professor Summers talked about, that these policing and prison institutions have been built up over the past 50 years, and instead to reinvest those funds into other essential public services, rather than continuing with the same reform proposals. And so I think we really have to give credit to how much has happened in the last decade alone to explain what's going on today.
Yeah, can I just follow up on Professor Glass, and he brought up the defund the police movement, and which of course rests on a recognition that police are by the default of first responders because money has been taken out of, it's been drained from other social services. And there's actually a pretty rich irony here in the sense that one example that people use is the tragedy that often happens when police respond to an individual who is having a mental health crisis, right? And I mean, if we think about the absence of a mental health care infrastructure in this country, I mean, this goes back really to the 1960s and 1970s, right? When you have this patients' rights movement in the 1960s, who are basically clamoring for number one, the right to treatment, as opposed to just being institutionalized, just being warehoused in these large state mental hospitals, and then the right to treatment in the least restrictive setting, right? My own work is on mental illness and race in Washington, D.C. And one of the foundational cases in this area was the lead plaintiff was an African-American man who had been institutionalized in St. Elizabeth's, William Dixon, in 1974. His suit against St. Elizabeth's becomes a class action suit, and they win, and it begins the process of deinstitutionalization. And in many ways, deinstitutionalization itself was a progressive movement, because it recognized that people were not getting sufficient care in these large hospitals. So it would be better to decentralize mental health care delivery, so that people could be treated closer to where they lived, and then actually invest kind of therapeutic authority in the communities in which these individuals resided, But from the state's perspective, often it was just a way of passing off responsibility for paying for mental health care to local governments who didn't have the money. And then, eventually the kind of federal funds dried up. So by the early 1980s, even though you have these hospitals turning out all of these all of these patients, they have nowhere to go, right? Because there are no halfway houses that are being funded. So you have the increase in homelessness, right? And you also have the increasing incarceration of mentally ill individuals, and so this has been a phenomenon that, again, we see today. The prison system is the largest provider of mental health services in the country, right? And then, of course, you see increasing instances of individuals who are having mental health crises. Again, the first response, the first responder on the scene is often a police officer, and that occasionally, often, of course, too often, ends up in a tragic situation.
If I may jump in for a second, so I appreciate the focus on mental health issues and more broadly on the issue of neurodiversity and how the police force in the United States and legal system interfaces with mental health, neurodiversity, and how the police in its mandate to manage Black bodies, disabled bodies, neurodiverse bodies has been so brutal. And we tend to think about the criminal justice system as in terms of what society, what the society does to people that comes under the purview of the criminal justice system, but the criminal justice system is what societies do to themselves. So societies become the brutal, cruel, cold, discriminatory criminal justice system that it creates. So crime and punishment is what societies do to themselves, not only what they do to people that come under the purview of those systems.
Can I maybe add just one tiny little thing here? And I think, something just a note on top of this, we haven't mentioned yet, of course, all of this takes place in the context of COVID, right? So we're not just living through one crisis of a continuing crisis of police brutality. We also have the public health crisis of COVID-19, along with the economic crisis of the economic collapse. And so I think another reason for these heightened debates about police budgets is the fiscal crises that are coming for state and local governments. I was reading up today about New York City's budget, where I'm currently living. Basically, tax revenues are down somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3. And the initial budget proposal had zero reductions in the police budget and massive slashes to public education, to the very hospitals that have been keeping people alive through this pandemic, to affordable housing, to a host of other public services. So in this moment, and we're living through a moment where it feels like everything's on the table all of a sudden. In this moment, I think that shifts the conversation entirely to say, well, okay, under these conditions, are we really going to say that we're going to slash all these other public services and leave police budgets untouched? And I think that creates this new moment of opportunity for these activists that I mentioned before to really push through a bigger critique of mass incarceration.
And I don't know if you're going to have the chance to go back and talk about sort of policing in the United States. So let me make a sort of proposal to action here. So I was very surprised when I arrived in America that hospital guards were armed. I was very surprised to see that guards in malls carried guns. Then I was shocked to see that police officers at the university were armed, that our university campi are policed by armed police officers. So I ask myself if that is necessary. So both beyond the issue of the funding or reallocation of resources, there is something that you can do maybe tomorrow, which is to ask our universities to stop sending out staff that occupy the position of security staff that carry guns into our campus.
This discussion of where we are right now has been quite interesting and lends itself well to now move to where we're going. Dr. Glass, how do you think the future might be affected by our past, especially our recent past?
Thank you, Amanda. I mean, I have to say, as a historian, my specialty is hindsight, so predictions are not usually my strength, but I'll try. I just want to take note, first of all, how amazed I am in these past few months at the scope and the scale of the reckoning that seems to be going on right now. The Reverend William Barber has, for the last 5 or 10 years, been saying that we need a third Reconstruction for racial inequality in America, the first being after the Civil War, the second Reconstruction being the Civil Rights Movement. And I don't know, I'm sort of hopeful that it feels like we might be on the edge of something like a third Reconstruction, a transformative moment. And just to note some of the things I'm thinking of here, the tearing down of Confederate monuments, which is a debate that Americans have been having for a while now, especially since the white supremacist massacre in Charleston, South Carolina back in 2015 by Dylann Roof. But what we've seen is, I think, a frustration over this debate and protesters taking matters into their own hands. And it turns out to prevent further unrest has been the winning argument for politicians to finally step in and start changing this Confederate iconography that has dominated America for the last century or so. It's also stunning to see people tearing down monuments to Christopher Columbus, to Spanish conquistadors, even British slave traders across the ocean. So I think what we're seeing is a global rebellion against white supremacy in all of its manifestations. So anti-Black racism, yes, but also the experiences of indigenous peoples with settler colonialism, and also the fallout from global imperialism around the world. And this reckoning, I think, is also playing out at the micro scale. And I'm sure everyone has been experiencing the spotlight on racism in their own social worlds. So in my personal world, as a new professor, I've been following the Twitter hashtags Black in the Ivory, where Black professors have been sharing their experiences of racism in research, teaching, and other roles in the university. And another hashtag, Publisher Paid Me, as someone who's starting to write a book, where authors have been sharing what they were paid for their book deals, which has revealed immense disparities between what's been paid to white authors and Black and brown authors. And this week, I'll note, I also read through the stories on a new Instagram account called Black at Boston College, where students have shared stories that reveal quite disturbing experiences in everything from curriculum to financial aid to dormitory policies. And so for people connected to Boston College, I really recommend taking the time to read through those stories yourself. And so while I'm really amazed and excited by the range of transformations that seem on the table right now that we've talked about, I'm also been frustrated already by many of the attempts to co-opt the uprisings. And so here I'm referring to the deluge of corporate solidarity statements with Black Lives Matter, the celebrity confessional videos, these sorts of things. Now, these symbolic acknowledgements, of course, are important. But my personal worry is that they might substitute for more substantive changes. So to give just a few quick examples, I have a Wells Fargo bank account. So when you go to the Wells Fargo ATM now, when you put your card in, there's a statement that comes up that says, Wells Fargo stands in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. Now, it's as if we should forget the fact that the role that Wells Fargo played in destroying Black wealth by peddling subprime mortgages in the build-up to the 2008 financial crisis. Or Amazon now, which has reprogrammed their Alexa devices, where if you ask Alexa, do Black Lives Matter? Alexa says, yes, Black Lives Matter. as if to forget that just 2 months ago, Amazon employees in warehouses were literally dying from lack of protective health equipment. Disproportionate number of those workers of color. Or even the mayor of Washington, D.C., Muriel Bowser, emblazoned Black Lives Matter down Pennsylvania Avenue, which was this incredible moment in Washington, D.C. I think people might have seen. But when people followed up and asked and said, Mayor, are you willing to consider reallocating the police budget? She said, absolutely not. And so I think it's important in this moment when change seems possible to remain very skeptical and to not be satisfied by these symbolic gestures alone. Because I think what I've seen in my own research studying the late 20th century is that in the post-civil rights generation of corporations, public relations consultants, and politicians have grown very, very savvy at incorporating political discontent while avoiding substantive changes. So I feel torn between these two impulses, on the one hand being very excited and the other being very frustrated already.
That's a very good point. Very interesting. I appreciate that. I think throughout this conversation we've done, well, not we've, the panelists have done a really great job of trying to tie together, what we've seen in the past and how that's unfolding today, and not necessarily a prediction for the future, but what's our stature now as we look to the new proposals that are coming up. So we've been getting some questions in from the audience. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, because I just wanted to follow up on Professor Glass, one point that he made, which I think is really important. I appreciated all of the points and also comments made by Professor Barrozo. But this idea of the need for a third Reconstruction, I think is a really important one. And I think it's important that it's been made by William Barber, who is one of the heads of the Poor People's Campaign. And I think if we're going to embark on this third Reconstruction, we actually need to fulfill one of the promises of the first Reconstruction that was never fulfilled, and that is, frankly, reparations. I mean, I think that we have to have a conversation, and not just a conversation, but we really have to move forward with all deliberate speed towards reparations. And I think a conversation about reparations is going to be really an interesting one, given the larger context of the economic catastrophe that is coming out of COVID, and the fact that not a lot of these jobs are coming back, and so you're starting to hear more discussion about guaranteed basic income. But we've got to go beyond that in order to give restitution to people of African descent who built this country, and whether or not reparations comes in the form of investments in communities. I tend to think that I go back and forth. I've gone back and forth over the past several years, but at this point, I'm thinking that we need to be talking about direct payments to the descendants of enslaved people of African descent in this country, in order to give us an opportunity to build up this kind of generational wealth that we haven't had an opportunity to do, and going back to the failure of the federal government to provide land after the Civil War, through the discrimination against African Americans by the GI Bill, and so forth, and so on and so forth. So I think reparations has got to be something that we seriously grapple with as a nation.
I appreciate that, Dr. Summers, and we actually did get a question about reparations, so I want to circle back to that at the end. It's in a context that I haven't seen before, so I would like to discuss that. But something that all three of you touched on throughout was the role that the law plays in civil rights and justice, and really in areas where we see justice and areas where we don't see. So I think Anthony actually has a question for us from someone in the audience for you, Dr. Barrozo. Anthony, go ahead.
Yeah. So, Dr. Barrozo, you've written extensively on how cruelty in criminal law looks to serve a preventative and corrective function. Do you think that new debate over criminal justice laws might shift this paradigm in any way? especially as a mainstream thought, seems to regret the harsh punishments of the 1994 crime bill?
Thank you for the question. I think our evolution about the notion of cruelty has equipped us to see cruelty even when there is no specific agent that is intentionally causing the sort of kind of disrespect and suffering that would amount to cruelty. So the best understanding of cruelty that we came to culturally possess is able to identify cruelty even when there is no singular agent that is responsible for that suffering. So when we look at the criminal justice system in the United States, it's a very cruel system. It over-criminalizes, over-punishes. Professor Summers reminded us that the criminal justice system in the United States is the state institution that is primarily in charge of dealing with individuals who have mental health or neurodiverse challenges. It is unspeakable. This is unacceptable. So I think if we look at the criminal justice system not as a mechanism for management of Black bodies, not as a mechanism for punishment, but as an opportunity to lift up people, to honor human dignity, to create spaces, urban, for rich manifestation of different forms of life. So we can see the criminal justice system as a tool of the state to promote justice, to promote human dignity, to promote safe areas for business to flourish, for education, artistic opportunity to flourish, different types of urban organization to be experimented with, as opposed to a criminal justice system that has been historically committed to the enterprise of systemic and structural justice.
That's very interesting. Thank you for that. And we also got another question that kind of connects to this idea of cruelty, and it relates to institutions of faith. So I'm going to kind of paraphrase the question here to try to see if I can set it the right way. In the U.S. now, I think there's a lot of conversation about what's the role that faith might play in religious institutions in enacting the type of civil rights movement that we saw with Dr. King, who before he was anything, he was a theologian. And Dr. Summers, I had read something of yours in preparation for this, where you had talked about the role that churches played in the South, and I was wondering if Dr. Summers or any of you had any thoughts on the role that communities of faith might have in trying to create a more merciful system going forward.
Well, that's really interesting, because I don't really write about religion or churches very much. But I certainly the Black church has been the backbone of the Black community, right, going all the way back to slavery, and it's certainly provided not only many of the important leaders within Black freedom struggles, but also kind of the foot soldiers, right, the rank and file warriors in the Black freedom struggle. So I certainly think that faith has an important role to play within kind of freedom struggles. I probably feel less, I guess, well, I don't know. It's hard to generalize or characterize, overly characterize the Black church, right? Because you certainly have conservative Black churches as well as very progressive Black churches. I mean, I think about my father's church. He's a member of Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C., and his pastor is actually extremely progressive. He and another Black pastor in Washington, D.C. actually sued Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola for essentially, flooding Black and brown communities with their products, right? Which, I mean, full of sugar, obviously lead to really poor health outcomes. But then, of course, you have also very conservative churches as well. So I don't know. I'm a little on shaky ground. I'm talking about the overarching role of faith, and so I'll pass it on to either Professor Glass or Professor Barrozo to offer up some thoughts.
I think that there are pockets of moral energy and clarity in many different sites in social life, and often the site of moral clarity and moral energy is in many of the religious traditions that have historically developed. What I think important here, now that we realize that the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States has gone global, is that there is a universalizable potential here to energize a fight for injustice and discrimination around the world. And we need a moral discourse that, even if it emerges in sectarian or particularist sides of moral energy and clarity, that they are able to take off to the level of universalizable struggles for emancipation, for justice, and anti-discrimination. I think the way Dr. King did that is to be exemplary. That he was able to sort of take the energy from his faith, from his religious experience, but articulated that in universalizable claims for justice.
Yeah, and just to build on that point, I think religious institutions it's a way to talk about politics in different forms. So again, to circle back to Reverend William Barber, who last weekend, I forget the exact number, but off the top of my head, something like 1.5 million people tuned into the new Poor People's Campaign virtual march on Washington. And I think what's essential to understand about that is Reverend Barber had been having Moral Mondays for almost a decade straight, where basically we're praying at the North Carolina State House and continuous political mobilization to build up this movement to make a modern Poor People's Campaign. And so I think we can think about the role of churches and religious institutions in keeping people politically mobilized, particularly in their local communities, where people are plugged into the various dynamics. Because I think the past month, we've seen this moment of immense politicization, where lots of things seem on the table all of a sudden. And then what I see happening already is our choices being narrowed very quickly. And I think the closer we get to November, the more we're going to be told that the only thing that matters is a choice between two things, two parties, two people. And I think that it's going to be important to continue this political energy that we're feeling right now, and maybe in a way that's not electoral politics, to keep the Black Lives Matter movement going.
Thank you all for your comments. I think all of you guys really just touched on how these exterior bodies can really play an important role in keeping things politically mobilized. I know, talking about from also a universal scale, you say how this is a fight for injustice from all countries and continents. So actually, this is another question from the audience for you, Dr. Barrozo. How are courts dealing with issues of social minorities and oppression in the U.S. and around the world?
It varies. There have been significant victories in the United States as well as around the world, but there have been also significant missed opportunities. And that is part of the problem of relying on rights claims, important, magnificent, institutionally speaking, as they are, for the type of profound social change that we need here. So by nature, these claims are reactive. And we need more than reactivity in the face of this extraordinarily profound and constantly reinventing itself discrimination anti-Black discrimination, anti-disabled discrimination, anti-neurodiverse discrimination, anti-immigrant discrimination, and on and on and on. So we need to be more proactive. And to be more proactive is to rely not only on courts, but also on our institutional imagination, creativity, to come up with proactive mechanisms to change things. And again, let me just lay down a very concrete proposal for tonight. We are in one of the safest urban areas in the world. Do we need that university and colleges, polices in the area to carry guns? Do we need staff at those universities to carry guns wherever they go? Do we need the police forces of our towns and cities that all members of the police force carry guns? So I want to put down a proposal that I hope the students will back, to ask our universities and colleges in the Boston area to disarm the university police force. I want us to ask our towns and cities to disarm the police forces, create armed police units that are deployed if and when necessary, but disarm those individuals. So the police force has been a backup force for discrimination against minorities in the United States historically. Let's disarm them. And the money that we save in providing for guns, let's hire social workers, psychologists, mental health professionals to be part of the police forces and help de-escalate situations, provide training, be on the site in events, in encounters with the civil population. We don't need a civil army in the United States. So let's start here in our universities, in our colleges, in our towns, in our cities, in one of the safest urban areas in human history. We don't need thousands of individuals armed here to police the civilian population.
And can I just, I really appreciate that, Professor Barrozo, and I also think that we can't talk about, we have to talk about disarming the police within a larger context of addressing gun culture, right? And gun violence more generally, more broadly in this country. And I think, so I guess an adjunct to your claim, to your demand, is to really at least get the powers that be to address the proliferation of assault weapons in the hands of individual American citizens. That, you know, that's got to be something that's on the table as well.
So one other question that we had, well, this will probably be our last. I just want to be mindful of time. And this kind of talks about brings in that conversation around guns as well. Is, you know, in the past in the U.S. we've had so many unfortunate instances where we've had guns in schools, and that has created horrible situations that at some points have led to tangible change, but on the local level. And one question that someone in the audience had was the role that, you know, schools have in making brighter futures, so that students aren't led to the same paths that the state has typically criminalized, where paths have been narrowed so much that people sometimes are limited in their choices. So Dr. Glass, I know you study schools a lot. Maybe if you'd like to touch on the role that school can play. And we also have a question here about school choice policy. And I, if my memory serves me correctly, I know that's something that the Trump administration has talked of. So I'd be interested to hear what your take is on that.
Sure. I mean, so there's kind of a very broad question there and a very specific policy one. Maybe I'll start with the very broad one. So all the way back to, I think of somebody like John Dewey, historians of education talk about, there's this tension in our schools, in our public education systems in America, where what are we actually asking them to do? So is the point of going to school to learn job skills? Maybe, perhaps. Is it to get a credential that you can use to advance in life? Sure. Or there something that was foundational to the establishment of public education systems was, is it about learning certain dispositions as a democratic citizen, to learn to get along with each other, to have certain values. And I think that that's the part of public education systems in the past, say, 40, 50 years that's really fallen out, where we've been told again and again that what we need is more standardized testing, more competition, more choices, and through this that we're supposed to get to a better place. And so I do think this is starting to happen. I think people are starting to question that model of what our education systems are. We've seen that with the teacher strikes. We've seen that with the Massachusetts ballot initiative, which rejected an expansion of charter schools, where I think we're seeing people, and I think these things are related back to what I was talking about before. These are very immediate questions, and they're not abstract. There will be cuts to state and local budgets this summer, barring a massive bailout from the federal government, which does not look promising. And what's going to happen under that context? Are there going to be mass teacher layoffs and further reduce the resources in public schools? Or is this a time to really rethink public priorities? And I think the last thing I'd say with all of this is, in moments like this, something I take from the civil rights movement, the Black freedom struggle, is that we've done a lot of critiquing of various unjust systems, which is important, but also to imagine a better world and the kind of things we want. And, I could go on about my own personal values and the things that I think are important, but I think that's the discussion we should have. And this is, I think, that activists have been very effective at saying this. If we are going to take power away from mass incarceration institutions, it's not just about tearing something down. It's about, what would you do if you had new resources to invest in something in America? Where would you put it? What kind of new society would you build? And I think that's the very inspiring conversation that can drive forward a really transformative remaking of our institutions, rather than accepting things how they still are.
Dr. Summers and Dr. Barrozo, if there's anything you'd like to add on how we can use institutions, whether they be schools or elsewhere, to make a better tomorrow, I think that's something that we should all be focused on. Yeah.
There want to be a better tomorrow unless we channel the institutions to embody the changes that we want to see. Otherwise, the changes will be transient and won't stick around. So institutions, claims for change and hopes for change are more like raindrops, and institutions are like rivers. So they are essential. So there is no place, no future ahead unless all institutions are part of it, are on board. But sometimes change doesn't need to start at the institutional level or at the sort of all the institutions at the same time. Sometimes small changes that apparently don't go to the heart of institutions can have ripple effects that will impact institutions more broadly, that will impact culture more broadly. And I don't want to be repetitive, but I will. If we were to change the gun culture in our police forces, university and college, and towns and cities in this one of the safest urban areas in human history, I believe that would sort of send us a seismic signal that would also, Professor Summers, hopefully speak to the issue of gun culture in the United States from a perspective that would take by surprise the way the dialogue and dispute about gun culture has crystallized in the United States. Disarm the police forces, and then let's see what impact that may have on gun culture in general. So I'm an institutionalist in the sense that institutions are essential, but I also believe that sometimes you don't need to change institutions in a blueprint way for that change to happen. Sometimes a small tweaking in one institution can set in motion forces that are transformative potentially.
Dr. Summers, I'll give you the last word if you'd like to hop off of that, if you'd like.
No, I don't really think I could say anything more eloquent than Professors Glass or Barrozo. So I'm happy to have their comments serve as the concluding ones.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, that'll bring us to the conclusion of tonight's event. Before we let everyone go, I'd again like to thank all of our incredible panelists. This was a really great conversation, and we had many other questions that we couldn't get to, but I think that's a testament to how people really want to engage with this topic. So I would consider that a success. For our audience, later tonight we'll be sending out a survey about what you thought of tonight's event. If you'd be interested in similar events in the future, and how we can continue these conversations going forward. Also, the Zoom function seemed to work all night, so I'd like to thank again our Office of Information Technology Services. They really came through for us on this, so I really appreciate that. And for those students out in the audience, if you're looking to get involved more with these conversations around rights, the law, and society and politics in the US, please reach out to the Bellarmine Law Society or the AHANA Pre-Law Student Association. They're both really great organizations of students who are interested in these topics, and I'm sure will be interested in having more conversations like this. So with that, thank you everyone, and good night.